Okay, so this is, I'm not trying to do anything original in this talk. I'm trying to report the field as it is as on May 6th, 2024. And I'm going to give you a roadmap to the problems in teleology as they have been seen by my discipline, philosophy of biology. And the map I'm going to give you is intended to be exhaustive. That is, I haven't intentionally done it, which doesn't mean I haven't left anything out. I just haven't done it intentionally. And of course, it's not exhaustive in the sense that next week someone may discover some really interesting problem that hasn't been on the list. Okay, so I'm assuming I'm pointing it up there.
Exactly.
Back there. Okay.
Something to read.
Happened before we got it working.
There we
Here
go.
we go. So, well, that type is small. But, in any case, I'm going to outline 3 problem areas in philosophy of biology. And then after I outline a problem, I'm going to give you my take on the problem. And I'm going to tell you what I think needs to be done, and what I think's already been done. So I think for most of this roadmap, we've paved it, we put up McDonald's, it's finished, and we've reached apex civilization. Okay, so the first problem has to do with teleological, let me just read the list. Has to do with teleological explanations. The second problem with goal-directedness, which is what most of you people are interested in, I think. And the third problem is function. And I'm going to try to tell you what the problems are, what the relationships among these problem areas are, and how, without knowing this, you can sometimes get confused because you have people talking at each other from different problem areas, thinking they're talking about the same thing. And I'll give an example or two of that. Okay, so why are teleological explanations of interest to, say, a philosopher of science? Well, the interest is they have this apparent non-scientific character in that they seem to involve backwards causation. So we think that causation has an arrow in time, that the past affects the future, but not vice versa. So if we say that birds have wings in order to fly, are we looking at the future consequences of having wings, allowing them to fly, escape predation, find new food, etc.? And that explains the wings. Well, that it seems to involve backwards causation. The effect of having wings causes that. And that's, I think, 99.99% of philosophers of science would say that that's problematic. That's why that's a problem. Another really interesting problem from the philosophy of science point of view is, are they distinctive? That is, are the sorts of explanations that evolutionary biologists give of things like wings, things we call adaptations, are they distinctive in nature, or do you find them all over the place in science? So those are the questions. Here's my take on the issues. So adaptation explanations are causal historical explanations. They explain the presence of an adaptation like a wing in terms of the effects, not of that wing, but the effects of wings in the ancestral line. And that involves wings and proto-wings, depending on how far you want to go back. So there's no backwards causation happening. It is causal. We go back before the evolution of wings in, say, insects, and then we look at how proto-wings might have developed, and then we come up with a story if we can. In that case, in fact, we don't have a good understanding. But we've eliminated lots of alternatives. And so you tell the story that's causal historical in nature. So from a philosophy of science point of view, these explanations are perfectly legit. Nothing wrong with them at all. Are they distinctive? Well, they are distinctive if you look close enough. I mean, I can imagine someone saying, well, in astrobiology and cosmology, we do deep historical explanations. That's part of physics. So this is not really distinctive. And I would say, well, that's looking at a very broad view. If you look a little closer, they are distinctive because they do involve lineages. We don't have lineages of stars. We don't have lineages of elements. We don't have lineages of elementary particles. Physics, mainly, the main part of physics is ahistorical. Historical parts don't involve differential reproduction and differential fitness. We can explain how stars evolve, but it's not in terms of some stars being better at being stars than others and reproducing themselves at a more rapid rate than other stars. That's not going on in cosmology. And therefore, I would say they are distinct. And I think contrary, I've looked at the program, I think contrary to what you might have heard yesterday, Darwin did in fact make teleology safe. Contributions. Okay. What's there left to say? I don't think much. I think this problem, interesting problem, important problem, but I think we've said more or less all there needs to be said about it. Okay. Goal directedness. Like I said, that's I think the main feature of this conference. And here's what I think is the outlines of that field. And it involves two things. One, what is goal directedness phenomenologically? That is, what phenomena out there counts as goal directedness? But that we don't consider that goal directedness. We think we've got a perfectly good physical explanation of that behavior. It doesn't involve contrary to Aristotle, it doesn't involve the bottle cap's desire to get to its natural place. It's just gravity. Okay. So how do we analyze this? Well, this I think goes back to actually the 50s. But then on into the 70s, a number of scientists and philosophers, Sommerhoff and Nagel are the two big names here. And Nagel sort of gets this stated in the most canonical way in a 1977 paper called Teleology Revisited. That's a two-part paper, the first part of which is on goal directedness. By the way, to go back to our first topic, the second half of which is on teleological explanations in science, and that, what he says there is laughably wrong. But what he says in the first part of the paper about goal directedness is, I think, the received view now. So what he argues is that goal-directed phenomena are phenomena that exhibit persistence and plasticity. And he gives examples of this. My guess is you guys have talked about persistence and plasticity. I think Dan, for instance, takes that to be the more or less right phenomenological analysis. So what's the phenomenon we're trying to explain? It's important to have an account of that. Before you go out explaining willy-nilly, you need to know what you're trying to explain. But how do you explain it? Well, if you can give an underlying causal account of the behavior, you explain it. Now the question is there a unique underlying causal analysis for all that behavior? You can't even ask that question unless you have the phenomenological characterization first. Once you ask that, then you can say, well, here's a way it happens, here's the way it happens, and that's the causal analysis. So if you go back to the 70s, there's this interesting exchange between Ernest Nagel, very important philosopher of science at the time, and Ernst Mayr, very important evolutionary biologist at the time, and they go back and forth over a number of papers, and it turns out they were really talking past one another. Mayr was trying to propose a causal analysis, which I'll say something about in a second, and Nagel was trying to give the phenomenological analysis. So there was no conflict between them, even though they both thought that the other was wrong, because they both thought they were talking about the same thing. They weren't. And so it's important for us to see one of the supposed advantages of having a good roadmap here is to see that Albuquerque and Albany are not the same. You don't want to talk about the advantages of Albuquerque when you're in fact talking about Albany. Okay. So I think I've already said all this. No, I haven't said the last part. So I think the plasticity and persistence criteria for the phenomenological account is basically right. With respect to a causal analysis, I think Meyer's analysis was not basically right. And one of the problems with, so his analysis was that teleological, goal-directed phenomena are those that are governed by a program. And in fact, one of the ways of thinking about Dan's project here is he's arguing against Meyer, but he's not arguing against Nagel. So you need to know where we stand here. And Meyer really never told us what a program was. It wasn't a very deep analysis. And so I don't think anyone takes that all that seriously now. That's where Dan is trying to, where that work plugs in. Okay. Now on to the problem of function. And here we have two really well worked out accounts of function in the literature. Each of them going back, I would say, at least 30 years, probably more like 50. But the first account is usually called the selected effect account of function. And it says that A has a function of F, so flight. What that means is that past F'ingness, which might be gliding, which might be proto wings, it might be something short of full flight. But past effects that are F-like or in the F family are what causally led to the reproductive superiority of the bearers of those traits, and therefore those traits increase in fitness. And over long periods of time, we think that things like wings can be made pretty damn good, but it's in this gradual process. To go back to our first topic, to say, give the selected effect account of function is equivalent to saying, well, functions are adaptations, and we give the function of a trait when we find a particular effect that plays the right causal role in the causal historical explanation of that adaptation. So these, just two different ways of saying exactly the same thing. This, just sort of as an aside, well, no, I think this is important, not an aside. So a lot of people will think this gives them license to use the definite article, the function, so it's a function. And it also seems value laden in a certain way. Birds really ought to fly. So there is some value latedness here, and the people who take this to be the scientifically right account of sort of explaining this stuff are saying, yeah, but we're getting the values in through selection. There's nothing really value laden in our account. It just seems that way. The second major account function in the literature is what's called the causal role model of function. And to say that in a system S, a causal system S, a certain thing, a certain trait A does F, and F contributes to the overall working of the system. So the system might be my car rolling down the road, the trading, that's the overall causal system. The trading question might be the fuel pump, and the fuel pump does what? It pumps fuel into the carburetor. And that serves in the overall working of my car going down the road. You can do all this in a value neutral way. That is, you don't have to think that getting down the road is a good thing. You don't have to think that any of that, right? It's just, there is this causal system. It does this. If we look inside it, we find some parts. Some of the parts do some things that contribute to the overall working of the system. So you could imagine, complicated mechanical clock, and we could say, the function of this gear is to turn the minute hand, and it's connected to blah, blah, blah. And then some clockmaker might have just stuck an extra gear. Lots of room for extra gears that just turns and does nothing. So in the causal role model, that would have no function because it's not contributing to the overall system of thought. Like it's just turning. But if it's like the big flywheel that turns the minute hand, it does have this causal role function. Again, you can say all this in a pretty, I think, in a value-free way. Okay, so which one's right? And that, bad question. Here we go. Let's see. Well, let me just say this. I think this should be clear, but the selected effect account is causal historical. It's an adaptation explanation. The causal role account is ahistorical. You don't have to, for instance, in talking about the clock, you don't have to know anything about the designer's intentions. You don't need to know anything about the history of the clock. You can just look at this occurrent mechanism, see how it works, and pick out if this wheel has this function. This wheel has none. Okay. Now, what I want to argue now is, again, not something that's an original position to me, but I've got some arguments I think are better than the arguments that we've seen in the past. So there's a very important paper published by Ron Amundsen and George Lauder. Yeah, George Lauder. And I'm guessing that's 30 years ago, where they argued that both of these analyses are necessary. So this is to be contrasted with a situation where I might say, you're allowed to be a pluralist with respect to these accounts. What they're saying, and what I'm going to say is, you are required to be a pluralist. Pluralism is necessary here because we need both accounts to do science in the area. Certainly. So I'll argue for this in an abstract way, and then I'll give you an example from geology that I think is more interesting than just the abstract account. So the abstract account says, well, what does those selected effect account look like? Well, it's talking about the selective advantages of having this proto-wing, this lineage. But why is that a selective advantage? Well, you might just look at, as historical geneticists oftentimes will just look at a gene and see how it's increasing in frequency, and then do some mathematical modeling to see if, in fact, we can eliminate a pure chance hypothesis. Okay, but you can say this like, and then say, well, this gene selected for it. But you could do that without having no causal role analysis, right? So you wouldn't be able to say, well, it was selected for because it led to birds that could fly, right? Because there's no, you get something increasing frequency. On the other hand, if you've got a good causal role analysis of a precursors, and you can say, well, because this wing allowed these creatures to glide for some distance, and given their ecology, this was an important thing to do, and so they outcompeted their competitors who weren't able to glide that. So in order to give an SE account, I've got to give you a causal role account. Not vice versa. I can give a causal role account purely ahistorical. But this is necessary, and there's certain questions that you cannot even ask, much less answer, if you don't have both the ahistorical causal role analysis and the historical selected effect analysis. I'm going to give you, I'm going to state a biological example, then I'm going to move to geology. Our most adaptive traits adaptations. Adaptive is an occurrent ahistorical notion. Organisms with this, do they do better than organisms without it? An adaptation is a historical account. It says it's there because of its past. So given both the historical and ahistorical, I can ask that question. If I refuse, if I leave out of my conceptual framework one of those types of concepts, I can't even ask that question. We have the converse question, are most adaptations currently adaptive? That's also an interesting question. But this, I think, might be made easier if we turn to geology. Cone shape is not, you don't have to take 2 semesters, 3 semesters of geology to know what a cone shape is. And that's ahistorical. It's talking about the shape of something here and now. Volcano is a historical concept. You can't be a volcano unless you have a certain causal history. It means there's a certain way this mountain originated, namely rupture in the Earth's crust, lava flowing out of that rupture, building up. And we can actually explain why most of those are cone shaped. So analogous to the 2 questions asked about adaptive and adaptations, we can ask, are most cone-shaped volcanoes, are most cone-shaped mountains volcanoes? The answer is yes. Are most volcanoes cone-shaped? Well, I don't know. Most is pretty vague. Some of them there are, but a lot of them. That's not really super interesting geology, but it's still a reasonable question. Now I'm going to give you a piece of geology that is super interesting. And the basis for my saying that is that I find it super interesting. No geologist told me it is, but I think it is. So I did some research. I'm not going to show you data, but the 100 tallest mountains on planet Earth are all plate tectonic in origin. They're orogeny. That's what geologists, the term geologists use. So what's the causal history of Mount Everest? It's 2 big plates, 2 big earth plates running into each other. And so that's the case for all of the mountains in the Himalayas and Hindu Kush. It's the case for the mountains in the Alps. It's the case for some of the mountains on the western border of South America. They're interspersed among those mountains. There's a lot of volcanic mountains as well. So being volcanic in origin or being originating in plate tectonics, those are causal historical concepts. Whereas cone shape is not. So here's an interesting fact. The 100 tallest mountains on planet Earth are all plate tectonic in origins. Now this might look like what scientists have always called, or not scientists, philosophers of science have always called it accidental generalization. It's like the generalization I look around this room. Everyone in this room is under 7 feet tall. But that's not a law. That's true, but it's not a law of nature. And one of the ways we test that for being a law of nature is we ask, well, would it support a counterfactual? If were Shaquille O'Neal to enter the room right now, he would be under 7 feet tall. No, we don't think that the truth of this claim about the here and now here has anything to do with what would happen if Shaquille. I guess it's what everyone would jump up on his autograph. But anyway, he wouldn't shrink. So what about this statement about the heights of mountains? That looks like this statement. But in fact, I think it has some deep, projective, explanatory content to it. And I'll just sketch the account. But basically what happens on planet Earth is that it's a planet of a certain size. It has a certain gravitational pull. It's got a molten core. It's got a crust, rocky crust. It's a certain thickness. And a mountain on planet Earth is essentially floating. It's floating over this melted core. As you know, if you take a float in a swimming pool and put enough pressure on it, you can get it to sink. Well, similarly for a mountain, put enough pressure on it, it will sink. And they're sinking all the time because the pressure is being put all the time by gravity. Here's the law-like generalization, or a law-like fact, and then the generalization I'll give you in a second. You can get more force via big earth plates running into each other than you can get from a localized volcano. Which means that the force that's holding up Mount Everest right now is greater than the force holding up or that pushed up any volcano. So one of the things that Stephen Gould made famous was this idea of rerunning the tape of life, where we can rerun the tape of geology on a planet like Earth. And the expectation is that for any time in an Earth-like planet, the tallest mountains will be plate tectonic in origins. Now, the tallest planet in our solar system is Mons Olympus on Mars. It's volcanic in origin. Doesn't that show my wall-based explanation to be wrong? And the answer is no, because Mars is a smaller, it doesn't have a molten core, and so volcanism can build a really big mountain on Mars. The point being that in geology and in biology, and I think lots of other sciences, we need this interplay of historical concepts and ahistorical concepts in order to state lots of interesting hypotheses and then to test them. Okay. And that's it.
Okay.
Factoid on the last bit. All right. You gave an example you thought was in geology, but there's an argument to be made that it's also part of biology. And the argument is that we don't have any evidence of tectonic activity on other planets. We know that we think maybe Mars had some in the past. There's maybe a little bit that could have happened in Venus. Io keeps getting compressed and pushed, but that's gravity. There was an argument at one of the recent AppSciCons that life drives the tectonic process here on Earth. So, still biology. Yeah, I wish I could reconstruct the argument.
Over here.
Yeah, I wish I could remember the argument, but it was that part of the carbon cycle. Maybe Dan's got something. Part of the carbon cycle that moves the plates is also produced by life, which is weird.
The version I heard from Jim Lovelock was that the Gaia guy is that it's grease. Dead organisms in the trenches off continents provide the grease that allows one plate to slip under the other and not to stick on it, right? And without those carbonates, without those skeletons of organisms and so forth underneath it, that they hang up against each other.
That's our final state. That's our final.
The final state, it probably is.
So is that true? And I doubt it, because it may make the process work differently, but I think there was plate movements before life.
Yeah.
On Earth?
Earth, yeah.
I mean, the oldest evidence we have of life on Earth, like essentially as soon as we have any rocks, we have evidence of life.
Anyway, I'm not unhappy if what you say is true. It's still going to be the case that we won't. So, as someone who's been in this literature a lot, you will get sometimes biologists, sometimes philosophers of biology saying, look, this historical concept is epistemologically risky. We can go wrong when we call something a volcano in a way that it's much easier not to go wrong when you say it's cone-shaped. Right? So let's not have this risky concept. Well, then you're giving away science. I mean, you might as well become George Berkeley and make no risk whatsoever. But that's no way to gain knowledge. So the idea is, why would you constrict your conceptual repertoire to cut off certain things that you could talk about? And I don't think, ease of use of the concept is a good argument. I mean, you need to be cautious about epistemologically risky concepts. And of course, there's this whole debate in philosophy of biology about adaptationism and people using concept of adaptation to Blythe away, but that doesn't mean you should do away with it, just means you should use it properly.
And thank you for the overview. I love good overview. Extremely good overview. I have maybe a dumb question about selected effects. When we're asking a what for question, what is a wing for? We look to the past effects and how they increase adaptation. Is the answer we give flight, or is the answer we give a list of past effects? Do we say flight and it's explained by the past effects, or do we just cite the past?
So we say it is for flight if the advantages in the past had been all flight related. So now I'll give you a nice real example. So there's this just gorgeous paper, and I'm going to forget the authors, but Dan will know immediately. So there was this paper that looked at the origin of insect flights.
Yeah.
King Sovereign Call.
Yeah, Mimi Cole, and maybe it was King Solomon.
I think it was King Sovereign. Anyway, so and here's what they found. So what they did is they built physical models because they knew what the early insect size was, more or less what the shape was, and then they did engineering testing, right? And so it turns out small wings, small proto wings, probably shouldn't call them wings, don't do you any good with respect to flight. You have to get to a certain size, and it's scale dependent. So they did this, with respect to so the early evolution of insect wings could not have been driven. What was it driven by? Well, they showed that there is a good thermoregulatory benefit. Now that shows that's possible. Given that we're talking about a long time ago and we weren't there, we may not do any better than that. So we can say it wasn't for flight, it could have been for thermoregulation. And that's the part about current behavior of insects. If you go outside on a sunny day, early in the morning, the butterflies will have their wings spread, sucking it up. If it's a hot day, later in the day, they'll have their wings up above them, so they're not, surface is not exposed to light. But then they show that once you get past this threshold length relative to body length, there are aerodynamic advantages. And so aerodynamics could have driven the second part of the evolution of insect wings. So are insect wings for flight? I think you can say yes, but realizing that the early evolution of it wasn't driven by aerodynamics. It was driven perhaps by thermoregulation.
A function and continue to change, not things.
Yeah. And so there are flightless birds. We can say that, we can say that in the lineage, they're deeply embedded. Dead wings are for flight, and they've just sort of quit doing it. But it may take on some secondary functions where you need to, sort of zoom in on that lineage and see what's been going on.
Thank you for the brief talk. So as you point out that it seems like both the selected effects are necessary. And I think I agree with that, but I wanted to sort of run an argument by you and see what you think of it. So Paul this argument where he tries to sort of reduce the selected effects account to the causal role account. And he does that by saying like, well, something has been selected for, it means that the trait has produced some effect that caused, a change in the frequency of that trait in the population. So if we say that, the population itself is a system, then the trait, you could say had the causal role function of, doing whatever to increase the fitness of the organism, which then produced this effect in the system, which was changing its makeup with relation to this specific trait. And so by doing so, he tries to sort of reduce the selected effects account to the causal role account. I guess, do you think that is a sort of plausible move that you might make? I was thinking like, especially as you're talking to Niall about this, these examples of function change, like in the context of insect wings, maybe one sort of advantage of this kind of approach is that it sort of maybe forces you to specify the time frame of the selection that you're talking about. So you could say, well, insect wings had the function of thermoregulation at some time in the past because that effect, again, produced this change in the sort of makeup of the population with respect to that trait. And then it has the function of flight, which presumably in many species it now has, because that's now what they're doing to maintain the rate of wings in the insect population. I don't know what you think about this.
So here's what I think, and I more or less said it, but let me just be more explicit. So if you ask the question, which account is more basic, more fundamental, the answer is the causal role account, because the selected effect account requires you to use a causal role account. Okay? So it's more fundamental. That does not lead me to want to ignore the very particular sort of count you get when you're doing a selected effect account, because you're doing this historical narrative that's driven by a bunch of little causal role stories in them. So you're embedding it in this, you're putting it in a history that's defined by a lineage over time. And so I would still want to make the distinction. So, but causal role is more fundamental. You got to have that first.
Thanks. I have two questions. So one, I'll ask my question that's most related to this thing. So as you're saying, you say you think we should be pluralist about function. I'm totally not opposed to being a pluralist, but do you even, maybe this is a misguided question, but do you even need to be a pluralist? Because as you're pointing out, similar to the phenomenological and the causal account of goal directedness debate, it seems like they're just talking about different things. I feel like they're not even competition with one another. I would think that's how
Actually,
okay, that's what you.
I'm happy with what you said.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's the same thing. I don't know. Sometimes I think if we say pluralist, we say that. I don't know.
So I would say it's pluralism with respect to how are we going to talk about function in biology. And the claim that I'm arguing for is we need both.
Yeah, okay. No, I see the sense in which it's pluralist. And then, as you mentioned, someone may have talked about whether Darwin made teleology safe in biology, and you said yes, Darwin did. In fact, can you say more about that?
Well, it's just that if by teleology we mean the sort of thing that's good, well done adaptation, explanation, and evolution gives, then that is good science. And if it gives us a telos, then it's been saved from the. So there were these questions, perfectly reasonable questions about is this even a causal explanation? Does it involve some weird sort of cause that physics doesn't support? And we can answer those questions. Doesn't involve that.
I guess I'm just wondering, you must have had debates with Alex about this for decades. So he's not convinced by that.
Yeah.
Long since given up trying to convince.
So I will just say this, and again, I'll turn to Dan, who might need more help with the quotes, but Darwin himself wrote to someone that he, in fact, saved teleology, and then wrote to someone else that he banned.
That sounds familiar. I can't say.
I forgot to whom. So Darwin himself was a bit confused about the issue. And I think the second one where he said, we don't need, I think that letter was to Rosenberg.
One thing to add to that, Alex wants to get rid of the spooky stuff, and he thinks to do that we need to kill the word. This is my take on it. Robert says we've already gotten rid of the spooky stuff. Let's keep the word. It's so goddamn useful, and it describes the phenomenon in terms that that make sense and lead to science.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not that big a gap between the two of them on this. I know you want them, and Alex wants you to be a big gap, but I don't really see it.
It's not just the word. I mean, if you're saying that, then it sounds like it's just a verbal discussion. I don't get the sense. I feel like he's saying more than just like whatever you want to call it. It's not. There isn't actually whatever things that look like they're purposeful, in fact, aren't. And okay, whatever word you want to use, go there. I don't feel like it's just the terminological discussion.
If you're asking about the phenomenon, is it persistent in plastic? Robert and Alex agree. is there a mechanism or an anti-reductionist story to tell about it? Robert and Alex might or might not agree, but it wouldn't be on the issue of whether it's goal-directed or not. I don't see anything phenomenologically or even causally that they would disagree about. And that's why I say it's a.
So I will say this, though, I'm not going to have the dates. This goes back to the 60s, I think even early 60s. Ernst Mayr introduced this term teleonomy. And the reason he did it was because of the word.
Right.
It was just like, this word's it's like DEI in colleges now. If you want to do DEI, you've got to call it something else. So that word's no good. I think Alex thinks, Ernst Mayr definitely thought that the word teleology was too loaded.
Yeah.
So let's just get rid of it. When do we save a term and when do we get rid of it? Those are sort of tough questions. And maybe he's right and I'm wrong about it.
I just think that if Alex were here, he would say you aren't right about what I think. Like, as in that you would say, no, it's not just about the word. There's something else that you guys are talking about that I don't.
So yesterday, like I asked that question, right, about the difference between eliminativism of the concept and eliminativism of the word, and Alex said, I don't believe that there's a distinction. I'm like, okay, that is a view. It's a cool view. So, yeah.
I asked him what he thought he had vanished. That is hard to say.
So I'll just give you my reaction to Mayer's move, which was, you haven't solved any problem by, introducing this neologism, right? That if you could solve philosophical problems by just introducing a new term, it would be a very easy discipline.
Thank you. One question, going back to the ancestral versus causal explanations of function. Maybe we've already drilled into this a bit, but to build on your example involving flight and thermal regulation, which I was going to ask about, another example that comes to mind in the case of humans, or cognitive capacities, might be language, right? I'm not super familiar with linguistics and philosophy of language, but I know some people like Chomsky think it's not entirely inconceivable that language just popped onto the scene overnight. There was one switch and we got discrete infinities and bam, that's it. And this sounds to me kind of like the image of punctuated equilibrium, where some traits might just happen in one fell swoop. And then I'm inclined to wonder, in the first 5 minutes that trait has appeared, before it's done any good, it still seems like it's predisposed to help the organism. And so I can't help wondering in that case whether that really does suggest that not only that the causal version, the causal process version of function is fundamental to the ancestral version, but whether really the ancestral version is just totally reducible to the causal powers version, causal process version, and maybe whether it has something to do with dispositional features of the relationship between the causal powers and the environment. So that, for example, maybe what it means for flight to be the function of wings once environmental conditions change is that there are certain opportunities for the organism due to implicit structural features of the organism's environment, such that when the trait is put to use in that way, it will achieve some outcome like increased adaptive or reproductive fitness. So I wonder whether really causal powers is doing all the work that ancestry is, and that maybe we could even think of it in terms of a disposition involving opportunities in the environment, relationships between, like facts about fit between organism and environment, and the likelihood of producing certain outcomes that we might consider value-laden or interesting, such as in the biological arena, increased reproductive fitness.
So certainly, again, this goes back to your question about the relationship. Certainly causal role is fundamental. I would resist saying that the selective effect is reducible to it because you're putting a bunch of causal role explanations into a lineage. And why are you doing that? Well, it's because of your theory of evolution by natural selection, not because of any, it's because of your theory of how that process works. So it's not reducible that way. And I think one reason I want to resist, just saying, well, this wing that just pops into being has the causal power for flight. And that's all we need to say is I can give you 1,000 ways in which a trait that's better adapted than alternatives in the population will not evolve. And if you're not satisfied with the first 1,000, I can give you another 1,000. So it's not enough to say that A prime is better than A in a particular environment. You've got to say all sorts of things about population structure, genetic underpinnings, developmental biology, all sorts of things to get it off the ground from being adaptive to an adaptation. Now, there's another question that I thought you were going to ask, and maybe you had in mind. When this wing pops into being and has the power of flight attached to it, and the organisms are living in an environment where flight would be advantageous, is that thing an adaptation? The time to the answer is no. How long do we have to wait? Oh,
15 minutes.
that's the science paradox. I'm not going to say, well, you got to go 15 generations. In any case, it pops into being. It's not an adaptation. Why? Because adaptation is a causal historical account. I always like, I think one of the great thought experiments, that this was not why he introduced it, but Bertrand Russell's idea of, what would happen if the world were created 5 seconds ago? And by the world created 5 seconds ago, he means also your memories created 5 seconds ago. He means the books on the Civil War in the library. He means the dust on the books on the library shelf, all that stuff. What would happen in such a world? Would there be volcanoes? No. Would there be adaptations? No. Would there be cone-shaped mountains that have the power to spit out lava? Yes. Right. So our historical concepts are talking about us. This is why they're epistemologically risky. They're talking about a particular causal history. And oftentimes that's hard to, completely support. In geology, it's
I defer.
Well, I'm gonna sneak a question in first. I know, right?
For doing this.
So, here's my question. I think I know where you come down on persistent selection. But, so I've recently argued that using a persistent selective account, when you look at the geosciences and you look at something like the evolution of minerals, there's some mineralogists who argue that you have to think about the emergence of various mineral species in the historical context. And when you do that, I think even though, of course, there's no reproductive differentiation that's going on, you're going to have to start to give some sort of SE-ish account of what's happening there. And I guess
I agree completely with that. I think that there's an important difference between lineages within which we get differential reproduction and sets of things that differentially persist. Notice I didn't use the word lineage because there are no lineages there. So yes, such explanations, which we get all over the place, is uranium fairly rare? Well, you have to give a story from cosmology. Explain that. Why is gold relatively rare? That's, you get a cosmological historical explanation, but it's different than what I would call, it's not a natural selection. I mean, you can broaden the concept of natural selection. I don't mind. I just want to keep the distinction between lineage-based explanations, which is what evolutionary biology specializes in, and things where there are no lineages. I mean, and I think it's just a really important distinction. And so in that sense, I would insist on a sort of bigger distinction between physics and biology than a lot of people would like. But
how about, oh, sorry. Andres, go ahead.
How about the difference between biology and psychology? And like you say that a selective effect, kind of like selection process might give a function to a learned behavior because you do things, you get rewarded for doing something instead of another, and then the behaviors that get better rewards, you retain them and the other ones. Is that like jumping, is that okay or not okay?
Yeah, I think it's okay, and I think it's closer to sort of standard evolutionary biology than it is to chemistry and cosmology, because there is a lineage going on there. It's just not a lineage of the way you biology tend to think of it, but there's still lineage that, you know, is in your head or in your brain, and in you as a whole organism. So yeah, I think that the analogies are strong, and you can give good selective effect explanations there. And just to say, the same is true of culture. I think you can get good natural selections explanations in the cultural realm, because again, I think we do get lineages there. We do get differential reproduction.
Very interesting, Robert. I'm wondering about the status of traits that might flip in their adaptiveness depending on situations. So, I mean, a wing is perhaps always a wing to the extent that it supports flight. But things like Maynard-Smith's hawk-dove model of evolution of conflict behavior, you know, where he asks, is it better to be a dove or a hawk? When you come to a resource, a hawk attacks and maybe wins it, a dove runs away. And his conclusion, I think, is that in a world of doves, it's best to be a hawk because you always have a resource. But in a world where everybody's a hawk, it's best to be a dove because the hawks are killing each other off. And doves run away and maybe find a resource tomorrow.
So there, I think, suppose you had a population of organisms that successfully modulated their behavior with regards to that model. That is, in populations with lots of hawks, they behave like a dove. In populations with lots of doves, they behave like a hawk. The adaptation would not be a hawk. The adaptation would be having the use the word program, but having the causal power of being able to be sensitive to your environment and switch your behavior. So the individual behavior wouldn't, you sort of have to jump up a level to get to the adaptation. It's the adaptive switch that becomes an adaptation, as opposed to being a hawk.
Right.
Being a hawk is adaptive in a particular environment, but we've moved up a level of abstraction. We're not talking about a particular environment. We're talking about things that experience a fluctuating environment.
The fitness of each trait is totally flipping.
Right. So with respect to this sort of analysis, I would say talking about being a hawk is not the right level of describing the traits, because that's not what selection is seeing. What selection is seeing is this adaptive ability to switch.
He has a version, I mean, in the pure version where everybody's either a hawk or a dove, it ends at, I think, 7/12 hawks and 5/12 doves in the population, and it stays stable. He has another version where you can flip individually, and the individuals that get selected are those who are 5/12 dove, you know, 5 out of 12 occasions they're a dove and 7/12. So it's getting very fixed. So it's they're just flipping stochastically in that situation.
I think that the idea of a trait, we use it as if there's no problems it's used, but in fact, if you're an evolutionary biologist, not every way to carve up an organism is going to be biologically meaningful. And the question is complicated because it involves genetics, it involves developmental biology, and it involves ecology. But you know, there are lots of things that we can describe that are not ecologically meaningful, but are measurable. You put a number, so you know the ratio of the length between the tip of your nose and the tip of your chin, and the number that describes, you know, the height of your elbow over your left toe and dancing. those are, perfectly describable numbers. We could do a ratio between those numbers. That's not a trait, sorry. But not that it couldn't be, but it's just not.
Sports statistics are full of traits like that, which are non-traits.
Just,
And then,
I'm here. So, is there a right way to individuate traits?
Yes. But it's going to be very case specific. So if again, if you were, and this goes back to the question between relationship with causal role analysis and selected effect analysis. If you're doing selected effect analyses, then you do need to worry about the sorts of things selection can see, but that is scare quotes, but that is something we can in fact look at, especially in organisms where we do cloning experimentation. So, but that's not enough. You really need to know, is there some genetic basis for this? What's the developmental biology if these two traits in development are so closely related that you can't get this without getting that, then you can't just consider this in isolation, because whenever you get this, you also get this. Then you have to do, some sort of analysis that's going to look at trade-offs and so on. So my answer is yes. Just don't ask me to tell you what it is in general, because all I can do there is say vague things, but I'm quite confident if you give me a real concrete problem in evolutionary biology, I'll be able to tell you what the traits are. And then, of course, new knowledge might come and I decide I was wrong. But I don't know what to do.
It is an empirical question.
Yeah, it's an empirical question.
There are many traits that have been thought to be traits, which when you study the developmental biology, the evolutionary, turn not to be traits. And the classic one is the human chin. What is it for? What selection pressures acted on the chin? Was it sexually selected or something? There is no chin, it turns out. There's two growth fields, one in the front of your face and one coming forward with the lower jaw. And where they intersect, there's got to be an intersection, right? That's what a chin is. And selection may have never seen a chin from. It's a face.
I thought it was an aid to thinking.
The beard is the aid to think.
Okay.
I'll add that one of Robert's students, Grant Ramsey, who was giving talks the other day, and Alan Love and other people have an account right now that's the CHIMS account, that's kind of a pluralist account that looks at all sorts of different things, speaking science and traits and science.
But in the present context of goal-directedness and feeling and emotion, affect, and all this stuff, it's really relevant, it's really important to find out what the traits are. 5 basic emotions, or is it 8? Are those real things, right? Is that the kind of thing selection could have seen? Fear, after all, there's fear of snakes, there's fear of embarrassment, there's fear of tripping over something, there's just fear of life itself. Are those all the same trait? Yeah, measure all the right stuff and they'll look the same, but that doesn't mean selection saw them that way historically. Fear could be 17 different traits with just a hint of joy thrown in, as evidenced by people who go to Harvard. Okay, you said, don't answer too quickly. You said you were happy with the Nagel phenomenological description of goal-directedness as purpose and plasticity, and so am I. People have complained it's only 2-dimensional. In fact, by the way, it's 1-dimensional because plasticity, finding the goal from an alternative starting point, is the same as persistence, which says, knock me over somewhere and I'll still find the goal. That's a new starting point, right? So there's really 1 dimension here to Nagel's phenomenological understanding. Why are you and I happy with this? What's our answer to people who say that's too thin a description of purpose?
Good question. So the first thing I would say is that show me a better one.
Well, okay, I can't. That's why I'm using it.
So I'm relatively happy with that.
Okay.
And I guess another thing that's important for this talk is to say that, once I said, you got to have some phenomenological account, you want causal account. It's not that those two things are totally independent. They may interplay a lot. I mean, your causal account may lead you to say, in this bundle, things we call goal-directed, that one's really not goal-directed. You might throw it out, which might lead you to change your phenomenology. Yeah. And so on. So it's not like they're static and totally independent, but they're, again, relatively independent. And it seems to me that we do need to know the phenomenon we're talking about, because otherwise.
So this is the first pass.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to someone to come up with something that's much deeper.
Okay, I have a second one, but I'll shut up. Please go.
I'm more interested in figuring out the intersection between the two parts that you talked about. Because it feels that on one, there's teleology, like a general thing, and then goal directedness and function. And I'm wondering, like, the space in between, is it like empty or what is there?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What is the question I was going to ask, I think, is the same one. What is the relationship between goal directedness and function?
It's complicated because there will be lots of cases. So I'd say our paradigm cases will be when we have an organism being goal directed with respect to a certain goal that will say that that goal directedness is itself an adaptation. And so the function of this behavior is to get to the sugar. Yeah. But that's not necessarily the case, right? There may be cases where, again, we've got a new system thrown into a totally new environment and something just happens to work, so we can give a goal-directed account without any deep evolutionary history, without using the word function in the SE sense, but you would still have the causal role function. So they're definitely connected.
Yeah.
But it's not like I can say in every single case, A is being goal directed to target T is an adaptation.
You can't even say one is more general than the other, like goal directedness is the general process that produces function, it produces non-functional things too, but all function is the product of a goal directed process?
I would not say that. And the reason I wouldn't say it is that it seems to me that we are perfectly happy talking about static things being adaptations and less, you would call them static things, goal directed. So, if the turtle's shell is to protect it from predators, I mean, it is an adaptation, and if the right causal history is true, then it's a true thing to say. But the turtle just sitting on the ground munching grass, we're not going to say that the shell is goal directed at that moment to being bitten by it.
Although in the evolutionary perspective, that shell is goal directed. Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm gonna jump in here because I haven't. Oh. Sure. So I've thought about this, and I have an argument on it. So Wright makes this distinction in his paper Functions, where he divides between goal-directed things, which are behavioral things, hence that active quality that I think that you're pointing out, versus passive things like a chair, which presumably has a function but doesn't obviously seem goal-directed. And I think that the argument to make that division actually ends up being circular, or begs the question. For me to make the assessment that the chair has a function is only in virtue of making the determination as to whether or not I'm using a historic account of functionality to begin with. So until I've defined what functions are, I can't actually establish whether or not the chair has a function. And if I'm already assuming a certain definition of function to make the division between goal directedness and functions, then I'm just doing a certain project. So I think Wright's argument there actually ends up being circular. So I actually end up coming down on the position that I think all functions are derivative goal-directed systems. I don't know whether or not that argument ultimately ends up bearing out, but I it does commit me to weird things, like having to say that a turtle's shell is goal-directed, even when it's just sitting there and nothing is seemingly going on.
It's the product of a goal-directed process. It isn't behaving in a goal-directed way, but a goal-directed, natural selection has to be goal-directed for this to work. And since it's persistent in plastic in its pursuit of adaptive peaks, lineage is planning the peak, no problem making it fit Nagel's criterion for goal-directedness. So if natural selection.
But notice you're jumping up a level.
Yes,
Yeah.
jumping up a level and standing back in time to show where this shell came from. It's the product of a goal-directed process. What's its function? It's whatever the goal-directed process gave it. And it doesn't have to be behavior. It can be just static strength.
Well, but that's where I push back a little, and I'd say something like the chair might have a function, that's a sitting device or something like that. It doesn't seem obviously goal-directed, but now I'm sitting in it. It is holding me up. Wasn't strong enough to do that. It would just collapse. And in a sense, that is an activity of sorts, right? I mean, I don't know if I want to call it behavior, but it's an activity.
Yeah, I don't mind it being an activity, but the chair is still the product of a goal-directed process. And that's what enabled that's what gives it a chance of being functional.
Yeah. So no, I want to say that all functions are derived of goal-directed process.
You could, I mean, a rock serves as a good chair.
Yes. Right, and it became one the minute I actively decided to create a chair, it became
But
one.
it has a very different causal history than a chair.
Causal history of rock turning into chair took seconds in my brain, but it has a causal history.
Yeah.
Right. I know,
But we can give a sort of selective effect account of what Gunnar was talking about, and we came for the rock. That is, Gunnar was wanting to talk about, people who build chairs and design criteria. So it is a sort of selective effect account, but the rock doesn't have that. Once you start carving on it, to make it more
You
comfortable.
don't think just picking it out, walking along in the woods, there's the rock, I need to sit down, let's make that a chair. Boom, it is one. It acquires the function of being a chair as a result of the causal history of my thinking about it. That's pretty weak. I don't like that it came out. I still think it's.
But this is my point, right? So I say, if you're arguing that goal-directedness and functions are different, you have to already have a built-in assumption about what a function is. Either it's historical or it's ahistorical. So it's a circular.
Well, and that's in fact how I was answering Dan.
Yeah.
I was in fact assuming that we are interested in also role functions and selective effect
Yes.
functions. And you could reject that, but I think to do that would just be stupid.
Well, we don't want to be that.
So I have a cool case that I was hoping maybe you could walk through with me. It goes back to the comment that you said that there's no such thing as the function of something, right? So when I was hanging out in words groups, I spent a lot of time with people that studied microbes, weird microbes that were eukaryotes but had in which their mitochondria had degraded, right? And mitochondria-related organelles. There's lots and lots of those. It's happened multiple times independently. And so, you open up any biology textbook, and you learn that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? The function, it seems, we say in Bio 101 of mitochondria, the function is to produce ATP, right? Gives power to the cell. In all of the mitochondria-related organelles that, well, actually, by definition, in all of them, they don't have that function anymore. But they also lose a bunch of other things that the mitochondria does. The one thing they never lose is the ability to produce iron-sulfur clusters, which apparently go all the way back to Luca. So that's okay. So there's a thing that is ubiquitous among all mitochondria-related things, and so when the person that I was talking to about this one asked me about, but what is the function of a mitochondria. And in my head, I kept like, considering all of the descendants of the original alpha proteobacterium that infected this ancestral eukarya, and only including the ones that had A2B, or it was, I couldn't figure out what the referent was. But
Yeah, so it's the, one way of putting your problem is what, am I talking, so imagine this big diverging tree. And, you know, producing ATP has been lost here, maybe lost here, maybe lost here. Are you talking about one particular lineage? Or are you talking about the tree? Those are going to be very different questions.
yet it seems the thing that makes mitochondria distinctive, the reason we pick it out, the reason it is in the tree in the first place, right? The reason it made its way was because of one thing that just had been lost in a bunch of these lineages.
Yeah.
So the story is weirdly complicated.
Yeah. So I don't think I said you should never use the definite article. I'm just saying we should be wary of it. And so, you know, if the story of insect wings is more or less, as Kingsolver and Cole suggested, might be, I mean, they're pretty guarded, but if it is that way, then it would be false to say that the function of wings in insects is flight. It would be true to say a function of wings in insects is flight, but there's another important function, which is thermoregulation. So will there be another nice example of this? I'm reminded of when you're talking about something that's really deep in the tree of life, is the PAX6 gene, which, you know, is at least 400 million years old and found in a wide variety of organisms. And you can read some, if you look it up, you'll find some places that say the function PAX6 is to build eyes. But in fact, PAX6 is used ubiquitously in all sorts of development processes. You know, it does build eyes, but it builds lots of other things too. So it would be false, unless none of those others have any selective effect, which is highly doubtful. It would be false to say that that's the function. It would be correct to say it is a function. Which is not to deny that there might be some cases where that article does apply, but those will probably be more rare than you might think.
And with that, offer thanks to Robert.